Well, welcome all of you who are in class and online for our final lecture. Hard to believe that the semester's gone so quickly. And what we're going to do today is a shorter lecture and invite some discussion both here in the room, and I'll set up a discussion board online. Just general discussion, nothing accessible, but any questions you might have, any comments, anything you want to bring up with your peers, any ideas for further study you might like to talk about. And we'll obviously be able to facilitate that here in the class, and we'll be online facilitating that there as well. So please do make the most of that time. But thank you all for your participation across the 12 weeks. I think we all would like to say at the outset, we haven't had the chance to mark the latest discussion boards yet. But again, they continue to impress. So thank you for the way in which you've engaged with those, the way in which you've engaged with each other, and the way in which you've engaged with the content across the semester. It's been fantastic. Just two little admin things before we get going today. One is you would have received an email a little while ago about course evaluations, and you click on the link and you can go out and fill out an electronic course evaluation form. Please do. I know it's not compulsory, obviously it's not a part of your assessment or anything like that, it's completely anonymous. But it does help us a lot if you can get in there and fill those forms out. And as you know, this is the first time we've run THEO1040 in this way, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated. And please do feel free to send an email through to us as well if you've got any other thoughts on the course that you'd like us to know directly. So we thought this week you'll hear from all three of us again. It's becoming a bit of like a song and dance at the front here, and passing off the lead role to everybody in the crew. And it's good to get a few different voices, I think. So today what we're going to be doing is launching into the 21st century, which is of course our context, with a view to not only naming some of the theologians that are alive now and are doing theology today, but also empowering you as theologians in the 21st century, because now that you've finished this course, you're more theologically literate than probably 99% of the people on the planet. So you're theologians as well, and you're joining a group of perhaps troubled characters in one sense, also enlightened characters in another sense, and hopefully a group that has something to offer a world today which needs something good offered to it. So I'm going to start off today, and my session is only going to be very brief, but just with a vision for what kind of a theology might work in the 21st century. And this comes out of our awareness over the last 12 weeks that there are better and worse ways of going about the task of theology. And there are consequences for the way in which we think theologically too. We've seen throughout this history course, in one sense, that the history of our world is closely intertwined with the history of theology and the way people have thought about theology. In other words, the way a group of people, an influential group of people, think about God has an influence in the way they act in the world. It has an influence in the kind of structures they produce, and eventually has an influence on everyday life. So it's not just some pie-in-the-sky, ivory tower stuff, this discipline. It does have implications. And we've seen throughout how some of those implications can be quite nasty in some contexts. I think we're all very moved a couple of weeks ago, especially looking at the beginnings of the 20th century and the links between theology and the Holocaust, and what was born out of that, and what came after that as the theological response to the Holocaust. We need to do something new here. And in that week, I talked about the problem of totalization, which is a Levinasian term, which means that reduction of things to an idea. My idea is adequate. You see this in all sorts of fundamentalism. My idea is the adequate idea, not open to anything else. I can fit it all into this box. There's no new information for me. I've got the truth, I've got the Bible, I've got God, whatever. We open ourselves up when we get into that kind of mindset for all sorts of violence. And we've seen different kinds of violence come out of theology across the semester. Some of it's been what you might call an ideological violence, shutting down the discussion Some of it has been a very real physical violence that leads from certain ideas about God and about religion and about who's in and who's out. So I just revisit that problem there as a warning. There's a poet, an American poet called Anne Lamott, who wrote I think it's in an opinion piece somewhere, and it's just floating around the internet, this quote. It says something like, "You can safely assume that you've created your God in your own image if it turns out that that God hates all the same people that you do." I think it's a good warning for us as theologians who are talking about who are talking about God, just to be a bit careful, to mind our language. So how might we do that? Well, this is just a little suggestion here. I've been dying to use the quote I'm about to read you for a long time in a lecture and waiting for the right time, and I think I've found the right time today. So I think that what we need is a theology, at least a way of approaching theology, that comes to the discipline like a child. And by that I don't mean it comes to the discipline, naive, without any background, but at least with an openness to considering what is new, to considering what is different than. Those of you who have children know this, or perhaps little brothers and sisters or cousins or whatever. When a child sees something, they just say what they see. They allow themselves to be present to what they see. They describe it as it is, as it appears to them, without any sort of agenda behind it, any need to shut it down. There's a real attentiveness to the situation. And this comes through lovely in a Douglas Adams book. Some of you might know of Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series and a number of other things. And there's a great quote that comes through in an exchange between Arthur and a fellow called Wonko the Sane. So if you want to know why he's called that, you can go and read the book. But this is a comment about scientists, but I think it applies equally well to theologians as well. So I haven't read to a group for a long time. I'm just going to read you something from this book. A scientist must be absolutely like a child. And sorry about the exclusive language here, but to avoid confusing myself, I'll just stick with it. If he sees a thing, he must say that he sees it, whether it was what he thought he was going to see or not. See first, think later, and then test. But always see first. Otherwise, you'll only see what you're expecting. Most scientists forget that. And let me just use a little poetic license on Adams here. A theologian must be absolutely like a child. If he or she sees a thing, they must say that they see it, whether it was what they thought they were going to see or not. See first, think later, then test. But always see first. Otherwise, you'll only see what you're expecting. Most theologians forget that. I think we've probably come across theologians throughout the course who have forgotten that, who have preferred to think that this system that I have, or this pyramid that I'm in, has everything we need, and there's no capacity to listen to new information, to be challenged by new information. It's what you might call a little bit of intellectual empathy in the task of theology. We can't escape the fact that we're doing theology today in the age of globalization, in the age of ideas confronting each other in the public square, ideas which often won't get along terribly well. They're not natural bedfellows, if you like. And we can't get away from that situation. We can't get away from those discussions. We can't get away from those different perspectives that we're going to be encountering. But what we can do is ensure that the way in which they are encountered is fruitful and helpful. And instead of leading to totalization and violence, leads to the sort of civil discourse and good conversation like what you've been having on your discussion boards that actually makes progress, theological progress. This isn't about some sort of relativism, theological relativism, which just says, oh, well, all perspectives are equally valid. It doesn't matter, there are no real truth claims here. This is actually about engaging in conversation in the search for theological truth. Because only when we can engage with that conversation well can we hope to be open to the truths that will ultimately make theology a discipline which has something good to contribute today. So that's not a letting go of everything that's gone before us. Indeed, it'll be building on the best of what's gone before us. But also encountering the other person, encountering the other group, encountering the other idea and asking, what might we learn from that, or what do we have to offer that? At the end of the day, that might be, how might we challenge that? Because for one reason or another it's inadequate. Or on the other side, how might it challenge us? Because for one reason or another it's shone a light on how we're inadequate. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it forces us to make a sort of criteria, I think, for what makes a good theology. And this is what I leave you with before we go on to some theologians who are doing this in the 21st century and who are able to do this in the 21st century. But I leave that with you to try and figure out, what are your criteria for a good theology? Is it a theology that makes, clear philosophical sense and all the truths align well and it's logical? Is it a theology that produces good results? Is it a theology, at the end of the day, that encourages justice, good conversation? So I leave that with you. What are the criteria for a good theology today? Because we've seen what bad theology can do. Hopefully we've seen what good theology can do as well. And I certainly think that in this room today and in all of the people who are listening online, whenever you get to the lecture, there's potential for some great theology to be done. So I offer you that as a bit of a lens through which to approach theology in the 21st century, because as well as a lecture about people who are well-known theologians, I have a feeling that there are a few in here who are going to become well-known theologians one day. And a few of you online folks too, of course. So I'll leave you with that and pass you on to Terry. He'll steer the ship for the next bit, and then later on to Mike. I don't know if you've listened to it online, but it sounds like a lot louder.
Yeah, talking about kids, when you said that, I was reminded of my Tom when he was about 5. It obviously picked up on all those anti-smoking ads. We were in some outside venue, guy next to us smoking away, which was sort of bothering us, but we pretended not to notice. And at one point Tom noticed, and he just, at the top of his voice, said, that man's going to die. Okay, this is just one of many very interesting 21st century theologies. I mean, 20th to 21st, in fact, 19th, 20th, 21st, very hard to sort of draw the line here. And a lot of this comes from the 19th century and the sort of explosion that happened there. But yeah, I mean, we could have picked on several. There's very interesting things called global theologies that sort of are in the same vein, but possibly even a little broader because they take in the whole ecological thing as well. There are ecological theologies. In a different vein, we've got, to me, one of the most fascinating innovations in things like Confucian theology. Now, if that's not pertinent to, the way the world's turning, China rediscovering itself, looking to its own roots, and clearly that's going to have major impact on the whole world. So, the fact that there are people in China reinterpreting their own roots and wanting to use the language of theology is I mean, 20 years ago even, much less, 100 years ago, you couldn't have imagined that happening. There's Marxist theologies and Marxian theologies and those sorts of things. There's theologies of the animal world. It is part of this re-emergence of theology as a serious and pertinent discipline. And I think we're sort of on the cusp of incorporating theology again into serious scholarship. But interfaith theology is obviously about as relevant as any of them, granted the problems of the world today, the intercultural, the conflictual problems are so heavily around issues of faith and belief of various sorts. Some of it, deep and well thought through, some of it probably more perfunctory and utilised by other ideologies, but it all presents as kind of religious sort of stuff. As I've said before, think you can solve Jerusalem without employing some of the theological lens, and that problem's just going to go on for a lot longer. Where did it come from? Well, partly from the influence of the Catholic Church, no doubt, going back to the late 19th century especially, and the likes of Providentissimus Deus, the opening of the Catholic world to the Protestant world, to what was happening in and around scholarship in the Bible, some stepping away from the old kind of ontologies. And Vatican II, I guess, sort of taking that to a new sharp end, including in the likes of a declaration called the Declaration on the Relationship of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. I mean, a huge movement from, syllabus of errors time, huge kind of melting of the pyramid and opening out to all the other ways in which people might have faith, and some language in there that is quite revolutionary. Granted what the Catholic Church had tended to be, an admission that God has spoken through a variety of traditions over time, that sort of thing. But probably, to my mind at least, the more significant influence on what's happened since is in liberal Protestantism. Because in a way, as I see it at least, Providentissimus Deus would never have been written if liberal Protestantism hadn't happened. And Vatican II, I don't think, would have taken the shape and form that it did had that whole liberal Protestant revolution in the 19th century not happened. That was the real melting of the pyramid to take the Bible off the top of the pyramid and turn it into a text among texts and deal with it as a text that had to be understood in sort of anthropological terms, and leading to what we have now, a scholarship that just slices and dices and reassembles and continues to try and understand, the relationship of the Bible as we have it left to us with all of these other texts that keep on popping up, fully understanding the Nag Hammadi text, all of that sort of stuff. The minute you take it off the top of the pyramid and say it's a text among texts, obviously you're opening yourself up to the reality that there's a lot of other texts and therefore a lot of other ways in which people have expressed this experience of other. And who's to say then that this is, the only way? That was the radical moment that came from 19th century liberal Protestantism. So we'll have a quick little look at that, and then I particularly want to, in case you're starting to think I have an obsession here, look at Bonhoeffer. I see from the discussion boards that a lot of you have got on to Bonhoeffer, and that's great. Don't let me discourage you. But I want to come at him from a slightly different angle and see him as, in one of his many poses, which is as a, sort of a godfather of interfaith theology. And John Hick, who just died quite recently, and a fellow I've met and can call a friend, Mohammed Talbi, a Tunisian most significant Islamic scholar. Okay, just quickly, I don't probably even need to put words to this one. We've looked at each of these guys. Just capturing some of these clear challenges to the old pyramid that came through in the likes of Schleiermacher, von Harnack. You know, this one that just never goes away. This is an important turn in 19th century liberal Protestantism too. You know, as the Bible's taken off the top of the pyramid and people start to really dig into it, it's Reformation stage 2 in a way, really try and understand it, then, you know, they're left with the clear sense that this story is, I mean, if it's a theological story at all, it's a very practical theological story. You know, if Jesus was revealing God to the world, well, it wasn't about high theologies, it was about ordinary things, living a life in an ordinary way, doing good, bringing justice, bringing compassion. You know, the prophetic story, the prophetic ethos was at the centre of the gospel. And there were certain theologies through time that had actually become a barrier to that, which is exactly what Jesus said about the religion of his own day. It's actually making it harder for people to find God because it's so complicated and full of high language and practices that nobody can come up to, etc. And in a sense, in the 19th century, Christians realised we'd done that all over again. And then Bultmann, again, the old Nicene thing. Arius still alive, and says, you know, one step on from von Harnack, it's not only John's gospel that's myth, it's all of them. We can't get past the myths that were created in those first decades. And so, you know, radical hermeneutics is the only way. Now, Bonhoeffer, his story, briefly, is talking of naive. I think I could say a very naive Lutheran Christian. He like lots of Lutherans, like lots of Christians in those days, everyone lived in their little box. He'd grown up in a fairly affluent German family, German Lutheran family. He'd grown up to believe that Lutheranism was not just a superior form of Christianity, but really the only authentic one. Like Luther, rejected the Catholic Church outright. Like Luther, you know, towards the end of his time, not very impressed with the other forms of Protestantism, many of those that had even taken a leaf out of his book. So this was Bonhoeffer. To be Christian was to be Lutheran. You know, Luther was the one who had, at that crucial time in his life, stood for Christ, stood against the church, stood against the empires, said, you know, here I stand, so help me God, you know, I'm the true Christian. Bonhoeffer believed it. He believed that to be Christian meant to be Lutheran. So when he saw the likes of the Concordat between the Catholic Church and Mussolini in 1929, horrified as he wasn't all that surprised. You know, in a sense, that's kind of what Catholics do. They play the political game. And then he saw the same thing happening in 1933 between Hitler and the German Catholic Church. And then gradually other Protestant churches also starting to get on the good side of the regime. Doesn't surprise him. And even some Lutherans, but they're bad Lutherans. He has this fundamental belief that somehow at the end of the day, Luther will come through, Luther's church, And Lutheranism will be the Christianity that will stand against this oppressive, unjust regime. And he sort of seems to carry that belief with him right through to the time he's thrown in the concentration camp in 1943, and here's the key turn behind him, and very soon after the word goes out that all of the Lutheran pastors have been told not to communicate with Bonhoeffer. He's been a naughty boy, and it could be bad for the church to be known to be associated with him. So they're not even allowed to write to him, much less go and visit him. And Eberhard Bethke, his friend, letters to a friend, really does take his life in his hands in terms of the police, but also in terms of the church. Could have been defrocked for, the communication that he keeps up with Bonhoeffer. That's Bonhoeffer's lowest moment. That's when he realises that even Lutheranism has fallen apart in the face of this oppressive regime. And of course from there it just gets worse and worse and worse as he hears that Himmler is employing Lutheran theology to justify the setting up of the camps and the so-called final solution. And that seems to be the breaking point. That's when his mind is released, in a way, from what had held him back. He realises that his own naivety had held him back, not only from understanding what's going on, but in his terms, from understanding who God is. That God is not, at the end of the day, a Lutheran God. God is where God is. God is of the world. And that's how we have to understand him. And it's the only sort of theology that's worth having. So he spends the last bit of his life teasing this out. And it becomes a kind of an interfaith journey. These are his key influences, and he comes to see that in many ways, in their different ways, they've actually given him the key to release himself from his naive beliefs. His big question through his prison theology is, who's Christ for us today? He's spent quite a bit of time fiddling around with the notion with von Harnack and Bultmann about who was the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith. But then he sort of comes to this point of saying, well, that's one thing, but what's the point? Even if we do find out who the Jesus of history was, if we can't work out what it all means for us today. I mean, who's Christ when the movement that goes in his name is acting like this? Is not only kowtowing, but complicit, and actually being used. Its theology is being used to justify the setting up of extermination camps. What's left of it? Where does Christianity go from here? How can it ever come out of this? How can it ever hold its head high again? So it becomes, this earnest, agonising sort of mental journey, I guess, for this guy. His central belief, he's come to see now, God is Lord of the world. Jesus is real God. Luther's God is Lord of the world. But it's that God that somehow or other revealed in Christ that's not coming through. Clearly, this God, this Lord of the world, could not be behind the grotesque enterprise that he sees being played out in Christianity's name. He doesn't hold back from laying the blame for Nazism on certain Christian theologies, including those of Luther. It's a hard thing for him to own, granted where he's come from, but that's the point he gets to. He sees the utter perniciousness of a lot of the ways in which the church has constructed its own very partisan and quite explicitly anti-Semitic theologies. And for him, that is unforgivable. That is the church lost its way. That's Christianity misdirected. His solution, if you like, or his proposition is that Christianity as such is not the problem. Jesus is not the problem. The Lord of the world is not the problem. But this thing he calls religion. Religion that's become so encased in the politics of the day, and take it back to the 4th century and the Greco-Roman thing. That's the problem. Religion's become a piece of paraphernalia, political, social paraphernalia, rather than a vehicle for revealing the Lord of the world. So religion is the problem. It's reduced the Lord of the world, the one who wants to be the Lord of all, to this partisan and, from his point of view, quite vindictive, Jew-hating branch manager. So it's not just the branch manager thing that's wrong, it's the nature of the branch manager. This is not a God, this is a devil. Christians are worshipping a devil. Those who believe that somehow or other God could be behind these appalling actions. They're worshipping a devil. And it's a devil that's come through a religious artefact. So the only viable future for Christianity that he sees is in this thing he calls religionlessness, a religionless Christianity, a Christianity that gets so far back to what it was meant to be about in the first place. It has to unpick all of everything that's happened over 2,000 years, and particularly 1,700 years. It has to go all the way back to those decisions made, particularly around the time of Nicaea, etc. He talks about a secular theology, which is really interesting, again, in terms of what we're saying about theology. Theology for the world, not theology for churches, a theology for the world. He talks about a secular theology, freed of religion, theology released from, the partisan self-interest of different religious forms as the only theology that's likely to have credibility from here on. He talks about the need for a non-religious interpretation of the Gospels for this thing he describes as the world come of age. He talks about the costly grace option. Cheap grace, we see where that leads when people just go along with the form of things for the sake of it. Oh yes, I'm Christian, yes, I go to church, I do the right things. And, Hitler's a well-meaning chap, good for the German people, blah, blah. No, the only option for Christians from here on is the costly one. You stand for what you believe. What he calls an arcane discipline or a secret discipline. It's between you and God. You don't do it for the form, you do it for the force. He talks about Christians being tested by what they do, not by what they say, not by what they profess. And he reflects on the neglectful shepherd, the shepherd who, it's said in the prophets, who neglects the sheep, and so God will take the sheep and give them to another shepherd, and it'll be one of the least you'd expect. He thinks that's what's happening in the world around him, that in fact Christians have so let down the game that God now is working well outside the Christian establishment, working in other religions, even working in and among the so-called non-faithed. That's what Lord of the world does. And so he goes on this interfaith search, firstly concerning Judaism. That's the big one for him, because that's such a biting issue. And through the intense work he does on Judaism, and it's quite painful for him too. He has some Jewish influence in his own family. His twin sister is married to a Jew, who in fact converts to Christianity. But early on in his pastorate, when that father dies, so-called unconverted Jew, DIETRICH is asked to officiate at the funeral, and he refuses on the basis that I'm a Lutheran. It's a shameful thing. He looks back on that in later times and realises that, as he sees it, he was part of the conspiracy. He was actually part of what has turned into this grotesque anti-Semitism. So it becomes a very personal search. And he really is one of those who becomes an architect of, the new appreciation, I suppose, of Abrahamism, for want of a better word, of the notion of the Abrahamic religions, that Jews and Christians and Muslims are really best understood all as being children of Abraham. And Judaism, Christianity, in whatever species, Islam in whatever species, is just a part of that bigger story. He suggests that Christianity's survival and certainly its credibility will rest on establishing a new, and indeed should be the oldest, relationship between Judaism and Christianity. This anti-Semitism thing that's been a pernicious force through the centuries in Christianity just has to be eradicated. He actively condemns Augustine's Christ killers notion. I mean, it's not surprising the Nazis were able to pull on lots of, juicy bits of Christian theology. Augustine's Christ killers and Luther's own, scourged people kinds of depictions. And he becomes, as I suggest, Fackenheim, who is himself a Jewish scholar, refers to Bonhoeffer as an architect of post-Holocaust Christian theology. But Bonhoeffer's search goes further. It goes into the Indian religions in particular. He has this conversation with Gandhi. Gandhi is one of his great heroes. He suggests Gandhi's a better Christian than most of the Christians he's met. Through Gandhi, he comes to understand Hinduism in a way that very few Christian theologians of the day would. And through that, Jainism being Gandhi's own influence. Gandhi himself he comes to see as an interfaith character. Gandhi becomes a model of what exploration among the different religions can do for someone. And of course through that, Islam. And he doesn't have time to write that much about Islam, but it's amazing how much those who are doing work around Islam as the third wheel on the cart of the Abrahamic tradition refer back to Bonhoeffer's theology. He says he thinks there's more Christianity in and around the Indian religions than in the entire German Christian church. And I guess his real pushing of the edges of all of this is where he explores the territory between faith and non-faith. And again, it comes from a personal experience. It comes from the shock. This is from the naive little Lutheran who thinks only Lutherans can really do good, finding himself in prison, rejected by his own Lutheran establishment. And you can only just start to imagine what that would do to someone's psyche. And this has been his whole world. This is the thing he's believed in most. And at his lowest moment, that's sort of like being abandoned by a parent. And he clearly has very, very deep depressive moments, even contemplates suicide in that situation. And typical of Bonhoeffer, theologises his way. Bonhoeffer doesn't think anything that isn't theological, theologises his way through his suicidal moments to kind of grasp some of these new realities. And one of the new realities is that the guy in the prison cell next to him not only isn't Lutheran, not only isn't Christian, has no belief at all, but is actually there for the same reasons he is, because he was appalled by what he saw and he had to stand for justice. And so the big question, so where's Christ today? Where's the Spirit? Where's God? What's it all mean? If those cowering cowards out there are church, if that's where God is, well, who needs God? And if God's not with that guy next door, well, there's no point in having God at all. So all of his old beliefs are thrown upside down. And he talks about, Christian atheists, a bit like Rana's Anonymous Christian. I mean, if Jesus came today, where would he go? Who would he say is doing the right thing? And it just becomes obvious the guy who has no pretensions to being Christian or believing in God at all, is, in Bonhoeffer's term, the Christian. And those out there are not. He says God's more alive in these people than in the cowering Christian community. So that sort of lays some foundations that others then will use later on. I mean, Bonhoeffer's dead by the time he's 39, for heaven's sake. John Hick, fascinating character, absolutely fascinating. It sort of takes the whole interfaith journey a step further. His main influence is Kant. I couldn't help but think of Kant when you were talking about, you know, the child, seeing it as it is. You've got to see it as it is. That's what the theologian has to do, see it as it is. Well, that's what Kant, he's one of the Enlightenment characters we didn't really look at there a few weeks ago, but he's one of the supreme empiricists. His reasoned philosophy of reality was a great grounding at the time, became the foundation of so much Western philosophy thereafter. His theory of perception is that the real can only be ascertained as it presents itself. You know, we've got to start with reality as it presents itself. He goes all the way back to Protagoras. We can trust this senses realm. In fact, we have to. If we start saying, oh no, the things I think I see aren't real, you know, start looking for reality somewhere else. No. You know, maybe do what Aquinas did, that's fine. Start with reality and prognosticate, speculate, that's fine. You know, don't stay locked in what you see, but you've got to start with what you see. And so Hick says, well, using that methodology then, you know, to the modern mind, religion's all over the place and it takes multiple forms. And so any person who's interested to believe has to start with that premise. You know, you start saying, well, you know, yeah, there's all these other forms, but I don't want to know anything about them. They're not real. Or to deny that they're there at all. Well, that was fine when we all lived in tribes, you know, and we never got over the hill to the other tribe. But in the world, the way it is today, if we really believe in this other at all, or are interested in it even, then what we've got to start with is the fact that it's all around us, and it takes many, many different forms. And who the heck's to say my form is the only form, or even the best one? Especially when everyone else seems to be saying the same thing. I mean, that's a formula for disaster. So he becomes a godfather of this thing called global religion. At a certain point, the Vatican declares him a heretic, which is a great sign that you're worth something. Insidious influence. I mean, the guy's not even a Catholic. The guy's Anglican, but he got so much up the nose of the Vatican that they even, you know, extended the bans outside. Not that surprising because, you know, because we look at the history of the Vatican, every second day it's declaring someone a heretic. What was probably more surprising was that the Anglican Church. I mean, that's one for the books. That's how good he was. I mean, Anglicanism is this wonderful loose confederation of beliefs, you know. I mean, I don't know if you've seen that Yes Prime Minister thing when they're trying to pick the new Archbishop of Canterbury, you know, and, well, do you think you should believe in God? Well, optional, you know. But even he gets so up the nose of the pyramid that even the Anglican Church runs a heresy trial. I mean, it would have only run 3 heresy trials in the last 500 years. One of them was on John Hick. So, again, of course, if Hick wasn't known before that, everyone wanted to read him after it. His foundational theology is that it's a bit like Bonhoeffer's Lord of the World. The divine being, you know, this numinous, this other. You look at all of the presentations through history and through time across peoples, it's beyond what we can reduce. I mean, that's what people seem to testify, this sense of the sensus numinus, the force before which we tremble. It's beyond categorisation, certainly least of all categorisation in words, reducing God down to a bit of discourse, like the Trinity. I mean, let's not be so silly. And this other is essentially unknowable, obscure. But of course, we do the human thing and we try to understand the ununderstandable. And we do try and reduce somehow or other through our language and our conceptions what is beyond language, what's beyond conceptions. That's a natural human thing to do, and as long as we know that's what we're doing, that's fine. And we're all doing it. We who call ourselves Christians are doing it in a certain way, and those who call themselves Hindus and those who call themselves Zoroastrians are doing it in that's fine, as long as we can all see that we're all doing this and we can all live happily together. And as we speak different languages anyway, so we speak different languages about God or whatever we want to call it, that's fine, we can all live in peace. And these become the claims of particular religions. And again, as long as we all know what we're doing, as long as we have this metacognitive gaze over the whole thing, that's fine. But of course, if we don't understand it, we start to really think we've captured God, we've grounded God, we've reduced God with this discourse. The Trinity, not just the Trinity, but the way I define the Trinity, is the only way, and you're going to burn if you don't yield to that, which is exactly what's happened within the Christian world. Then not only do we end up at odds with each other and war with each other, but his theological point is that we actually hide God. We obscure God even further. We push God out. When we think we've got God, oh yes, I've got God, here he is, in this little box on the altar. I've got God in my little, Trinity. I've got God in my little Bible, We actually lose God. That's his theological point. We push God out of the picture. He goes back up behind the clouds. He says no claim should be taken so seriously as to suggest that it has all of the truth, but probably starting to get a few clues about why he was the subject of heresy. No claims should suggest that, it is the truth. But, he says, put them all together. This is the interfaith point. Become a genuine student of religions, theology, get to know as many of the expressions as possible. And you might be starting to glimpse who this God is. So the prime position for HICK is that the believer takes a transcategorial stance. God is beyond categorising. Don't try to categorise, or at least when you do, see what you're doing, and be open to all of the many, many, many other ways in which God's been categorised. And this is where he came unstuck with the pyramid. He says, for Christianity to remain valid, very similar to Bonhoeffer's kind of thinking here, it's got to reduce its traditional claims from being the exclusive way of perceiving God to being one of the ways, obviously historically important, but one of the ways in which God can be perceived and understood. It's an option, and the fact that it's such an historically important option is largely to do with politics, let's face it. Who happened to be where on the right day when Constantine was making choices. And he actually suggests that even notions like Rana's and to some extent Bonhoeffer's of anonymous Christianity were selling this point short a little bit, because in our globalised era we can't afford to appear to be patronising. Least of all, as hegemonic Westerners, can we afford to be patronising. So we find in books like God and the Universe of Faiths, these sorts of things. Different world religions, different human responses to one divine reality. God has many names. He says, and he did practice what he preached, went around mosques, synagogues, temples, gurdwaras. It was evident that essentially the same thing is taking place as in a Christian church. And by the way, he started life a bit like Bonhoeffer as a fairly, evangelical Christian, so he also moved a long way. And in interpretation of religion, different world religions are culturally conditioned responses to the same reality. His Christology is fascinating. I think, gives us a sense of what might happen again when the nappies come off. Goes right back and calls Nicaea and Chalcedon for exactly what he sees them to be. Just inauthentic, politically motivated movements that Christians actually owe nothing to. At that point, of course, he was definitely a heretic. And if, they still didn't take notice, then he started saying some good things about Arius, and that really clinched it. He said, this was Christian evangelicism attempting to categorise the transcategorial God, the God who can't be categorised, Nicene categorised, and therefore, according to his theology, pushed God further out. At that point, Christianity and God became decoupled. And the real task for Christianity is to recouple. Again, it's a very Bonhoefferian kind of thought. It was about gazumping the claims of competing religions, including other Christianities. That's what it was really about. And he dismisses the Christological debates through the ages as being based on an exclusivist perceptuality rather than the real. Going back to his Kantian principle. And needless to say, takes huge interest when the Nag Hammadi texts are discovered. All of those things that the 19th century liberal Protestants didn't have at their fingertips. The Apocrypha, a Muslim gospel, etc., etc. And starts to predict what the future of Christianity, theologically, Christologically, might look like. And finally, this guy, Muhammad Talbi, Tunisian, I met him 2004, I think, initially in just outside Carthage. He has to be kept under wraps because he's so anti-Islamist. He really gets up the nose of the Islamists. Protests about Hamas and calls them for what they are, and plays the Islamists who are great at, pulling a piece of the Quran out to justify their horrendous actions. Plays them at their own game, and says, no, that's not what the Quran says at all. He's one of the few who's been prepared to speak out quite boldly. So he's very hard to get to. They have to protect him, and they do. And so, you could only write, and then he'd write back. And we made this arrangement to meet up in a hotel lobby just outside Carthage. All I knew about him, because at that stage there wasn't even an internet photo, all I knew about him was that he was very small. Someone in Oxford, a student doing a PhD on him, had told me that he was very small. So I'm standing in the lobby, looking out for people as they walk in, milling people everywhere. And in walks this little guy, and he really was about this tall. It reminded me of E.T. He sort of had a cape on. He's now about 85, so he's late 70s at the time. And he'd seen me, seen my photo, so he comes up, and he grabbed me. And at the time, my little Tom was about the same. I mean, my inclination was just to pick him up, and I thought, probably wouldn't be a good look for East meets West, Anyway, we're sitting there in the lobby, chatting away. I mean, magnificent mind, just a wonderful, if only the world had more Talbis, certainly if Islam had more Talbis, it'd be a totally different story. And I had my back to the lobby, and he was facing out to it. He's chatting away very amiably, and then all of a sudden he said, ridiculous, ridiculous, look at them. You know, I looked over my shoulder, and there was this Saudi woman walking in with husband with the full burqa on, not even the little eye slots, the full burqa, in what fair dinkum you can only describe as a sexy burqa, if you can imagine that. It looked like she'd been poured into it, and very high heels and clip-clopping on the marble floor and making quite a racket. And I swear every man in the lobby, you know, couldn't have been more alluring if she'd been in a bikini. You know, far from the, you know, what the burqa's meant to be, you know, don't notice me. This was, you notice me, you know. and anyhow, he went on with this tirade. You can see some of the, he's actually a lovely guy, but, you know, you can see he's done it tough. And he went on with this tirade about how ridiculous he thought it was that, you know, any woman would dress like that and give Islam a bad name, and, you know, and off he went. But he's an interfaith theologian coming at things from the other side and using his Islam, just as Bonhoeffer and HICK used their Christian theology to reach this interfaith point. So he uses his understanding of Islam as revealed in the Quran to say, you know, Islam shouldn't only be part of the dialogue, he believes it should be leading it. If Muslims understood their Islam, they'd be leading the dialogue, because that's what Islam is to him. It's a global religion, it's an interfaith religion. And he says, you know, things like this that is so against the stereotype, I guess, of what people think about Islam. And he's all the time going back to what's written in the Quran, which is exactly what gets up the nose of the likes of Hamas and co. Talks about the notion of God's family, community of communities. Everyone has the right to be different, accepted, fully respected in their chosen differences. That's what God's will is all about. That's what Lord of the world means. Lord of all the difference. No one is right. And he's very strong on that, you know, Islam especially, granted the reputation it has, just has to give away any, as HICK says about Christianity, give away any claims to be the true religion. He says exactly the same about Islam. We're all on this frail boat together. He does a lot of theologising about, you know, the global situation, the ecology, the financial situation, etc., etc. This is the way of Islam as written in the Quran. So it's just a bit of a taster of what I think points to hopefully a much more exciting and much more helpful set of theologies that might, you know, serve to bind rather than divide. And we'd better have a little break, and then we'll come back to Mike.
Who wants to sit in that seat? Elijah. I was, again, not wishing to sound patronising, I was just enthralled by that conversation. That was really, I think we've succeeded in the 12 weeks to have that open discussion. So it's a privilege just to draw it to a close. And yes, I hear that cry, where's Jesus? The beauty of this land is right under our feet. We have 40,000 years of revelation without even a Jesus story. And then, in this brief but horrible destruction of the last 200 years, this land has actually given us an answer also to assist Christianity, Islam, Judaism. But as you know, I'm just a burnt out old Marxist. And I just cherry pick my Marxist texts. and I'll find the red. Just that insight from Hegel that with philosophy can penetrate deep into the true nature of absolute being. Not absolute in the nasty sense of definitive, but in that sense of picking up from Terry's comments, there's a reality, it's a greater reality that we're looking for. It's surprising what we find in that greater reality. And it's where our understandings of words such as substance and incarnation, from the Greek and from Christian use, Nicene Creed, just dripping their Greek philosophy. But these guys were faced with the reality of the process, that we are in this process. The joy for me was that 2 years ago I was teaching up in Darwin, a group of school teachers, just doing an in-service and very hot. And I had the privilege of meeting this remarkable Daly River woman who I'd read, lectured on, but I just bumped into her in the staff room of the education office that day, where I'd actually been giving a lecture that morning on her insights. But Miriam Rose Gummer is a remarkable person. I'll just let you read from another remarkable, Catholic priest, Eugene Stockton, who's a hermit up in the Blue Mountains. The gift in their language is the word Didiri. And I remember Miriam Rose actually asking me at lunchtime, and what are you teaching, Mike? And I said, a little bit of Didiri. And she said, how deep can we go? How deep can we go? Because we are a country that's thirsting. It's a land that almost demands apocalyptic answers from our apocalyptic literature. There will always be, goodness will always survive over brokenness, sadness. The very end of the Christian Bible, that remarkable book of Revelations, which again is misconstrued in some biblical colleges where they only study Daniel and Revelations. But this land demands of us our attention. It will demand you your life too, if you tend to place yourself there in a dangerous situation. It's unforgiving. So from the shadows of a man-made structure to that eternal structure. But from Revelations, I didn't want to throw in Revelations. I always like to start at the beginning. And we have from Genesis, from our Judeo-Christian dreaming, our imagining of creation. The first question that the Creator God, the greater other, asks of us is not, hang on, what church, what religion, what fig leaf? It's that the question. And during the last 3 months together, there have been rays of light that have touched me in the statements even as recently as 5 minutes ago, just listening to that remarkable revelation, that conversation. And we had Terry's introduced us to this triangle, to the pyramids, to the question, where are you? I got this from only a brief discussion from one of the lectures, and I actually, for those online, you might remember and those here present, I actually did do a little exegesis on a very intimate passage in the life of Jesus. So I can't believe our timing from just our discussion at the break. Because the story in Luke 4, very early in Luke's account, you have Jesus being drawn back to his family, his life, his safety zone, his culture, his tradition. He goes to the most sacred place, his family synagogue, his place of prayer. And Luke dramatises it beautifully. Jesus, you visually see this significant person being handed the scroll of Isaiah, as a matter of fact. And Jesus, whether he could read or write, as I told you, he would have known just his oral tradition. He would have had the pointer, just pointing out a few of the punctuation. He would have recalled, and we have that great story, that great commissioning, the great Jubilee text, which I implore you to read. But just when people would have been thinking, and Luke was transcribing this into that gospel revelation, something happened where Jesus must have felt, hang on, the pressure's on me. And he did a remarkable psychological turnaround. He literally turned the pyramid on its head. And he said these words, that all that text that I've just read is being fulfilled today in your listening. So whether you see me as the Messiah with a political agenda, or the Christ of faith whenever you approach Christian scriptures, or whether in Jewish tradition you look at the book of Isaiah and say, where are we in the state of Israel today? What about the Jewish diaspora? No, the Nazarene did something very nasty to us. Turned it back and put the pressure on us. Whether it's a social gospel or an ontological statement, this has been fulfilled in your listening. And I hope some of you are now remembering where I took this to. I took it to another depth. Because this is the absolute. I'm trying not to say I had a terrible fear when I was listening to Dan speaking. Am I trying to do a totalisation? Well, yes, I suppose 40,000 years of human survival, they might have some total insights. Our Greco-Roman Jewish Christian survival, how long are we going to survive? Well, as a culture. God is where God is. At the end of his great dilemma with Christianity, Bonhoeffer. Who then is Christ for us today? Aboriginal women and men have looked at the Christian scriptures, looked at the horror stories of Christian missionaries. We gave you the alcohol. We took your children. The great Paul Keating speech from Redfern. But all the sorries and all the sadnesses, the great gift, as I expressed that day to you in the mid-semester, a brief translation actually expands that revelation. I said that day that they had no text. Their text was the landscape, and I remember pointing to the windows there. And I was thinking just before, sitting here, I don't like sitting over there. I do like to see a window. And the remarkable thing about that is the shapes and the dappled light, the poet's delight. But no, however hard we've tried, we can't get better than this totalisation, Dan. The landscape, our text, is being fulfilled today. Aboriginal survival of 40,000, 50,000 years would say to the Nazarene, no, it's not just in your listening. It is seeing as a child sees. Because remember what the elders said to you about that riverbank. Listen for the rush of floodwater. All of Genesis and most of Exodus could be summed up. You'll see. But do touch the straw that you touched to make bricks as slaves. Do smell the beautiful sensualness, not just a primitive aromatherapy, but a deep down aromatherapy. As we know from the psychology and the neuroscience, your smell senses go straight to your long-term memory. I still smell a little flower, and I'm there in grade 1, Toowong, Brisbane, 1963. And yes, tasting. That's what happens when we take our glasses off and look at the text. And I was privileged that one of you shared back and gave back to me my copy of the Quran. It's hard work. I'd love to live long enough to see an Wiradjuri translation of some parts of the Quran. That's my hope. Why? Because the Quran, the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, or Terry would advance that Hindu, the Sanskrit, all written knowledge, all recorded knowledge. We need to learn our exegesis from this landscape, this landscript. Why? Because it's remarkable and it's ever-changing. And it was ever thus. Whatever the physicists, the quantum physicists, going back to Terry's first lecture this semester, looking at all the other applied sciences. See first from Levinas and Dan, via Dan. See first, or you'll only see what you're expecting. Well, that's hopeless if you go out to Birdsville to see a big red now as a photographer. No, those damn flowers there, because there's been so much water there. You have to use a different filter on your camera. But no, never go to the beach and expect that romantic moment to be the same, because the beach has changed. That high tide mark. It's remarkable in its ever-changing detail. It contains our story, our beach scene, the great famous novels that introduce people, Schutz's novel on the beach. That's our normative text. But there's nothing normal about Scripture as theology. Nothing can be contained in an environment like that. To walk up Cradle Mountain is a frightful thing to do. Uluru, of course, you would never go climb it. But that's not just some corny superstition. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do. I could tell other stories that I've been privileged to hear from traditional owners about other places like Mount Warning, which I've climbed and I'd never climb again. But that Cradle Mountain, so much special in the heart of somebody as remarkable as Bob Brown, and his lifelong partner Paul. You know, it's just a remarkable spiritual centre of Tasmania from a distance. And that remarkable photograph taken by my nephew, he's a great bushwalker, very fit young man. The way he captured the hands of the dying tree, reaching past Cradle Mountain, the ridge, up into those beautiful clouds. If you don't mind, I might. Home videos, get your pillows out and but something a little bit more stark for me, because it's in the dead centre geographically of the state of New South Wales. It's about in the middle third of the Wiradjuri country. That tree's on Lake Kajolico, which was during the drought. Just you didn't have to be some person to walk across water. There was no water. But that huge, beautiful gum. I was sitting there watching the sunset, that soft light, and I was just playing around with the focus. That's DIETRICH. That gnarl, that face. That's what seeing as a child would see, as young Tom. You're going to die. Yes, well, there would have been a smoking ceremony under that tree. No pun intended, great respect to the beauty of ritual. But that face, through my eyes and through my lens, my hermeneutic, yes, I'm sure I'm not the first person to have seen that profile, that face and the fork of that mighty tree. Hopefully, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll have a chance to go and see it again. Hopefully it hasn't been chainsawed. Talking about chainsaws, this remarkable piece of art by Anna Chentareva, a Russian artist, now living up in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. Antoinette and I first saw this in 2005 when it was hung in the New England Art Gallery. A beauty, I must again pop there. It's quite stark. The icon is stark, but she has placed the corpus of the Christ, the human Christ of history, and the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, starkly on those trees of dying Australia. One of the comments is we cannot depoliticise the cross. The liberation theologians keep warning us about that. If you're going to use Christ or Jesus or Christianity as if you're using the prophets or Islam, be ready for a Marxist to come along and ask you, where's the politics in this? Up until the drought broke, there was lots of political climate change. I used to speak about that beautiful piece of Australian artwork. But we still thirst for more, for an Easter rising or whatever. In the shadows of that, we're confronted to that we must acknowledge gift. And these words to an Indigenous poll, to the indigenous peoples of this country, a man who basically saw the destruction of his Europe in the 20th century. And I love that little clip art shot of him because it captures his worry. He knew all the questions. Some think he had the answers. Well, he had some good answers, especially when he referred to the 20th century as the century of death. But his voice to the Indigenous peoples, again a little patronising, but no, he emphasised what Miriam Rose was offering, that the other culture, the other cultures have so much to offer us. And particularly here in this great Southland of the Spirit, we've had so many cultures come here, particularly in the last 200 years, the European and all peoples who have come to this land as a point of refuge. But there is something unique about this land, how it accepts you. But do we accept it? With great respect and love for English poets and English philosophy, I'll finish with a couple of these little pieces from T.S. Eliot's remarkable little... They wrote beautifully, these poets, but to sum up some of the philosophy that we've discussed, the theology here is profound. And to close that address, John Paul captured, not sure whether John Paul Caravautil ever has read T.S. Eliot, be an interesting little insight, whether he's ever quoted English poets, but the interesting side is he closed that address back in 1986. Boy, 1986. You are like a tree standing in the middle of a bushfire. The leaves are scorched and the bark is scarred and burnt. But inside the tree, the sap is still flowing, and under the ground, the roots are still strong. Like that tree, you have endured the flames, and you shall have the power to be reborn. The time for this rebirth is now. A lovely response to the Holocaust. Those Holocausts known, those in our own lives. The Holocausts that the ancients, the elders, have felt and seen. Whatever the future lies for that carved land through ice ages past and ice ages in the future. I couldn't help when I put that up on a full screen to see almost the map of Australia there. Again, a frightening image, really. Frighteningly beautiful. Puts it even in further perspective. Sadly, but joyfully also, I found that we're reverencing there the Horn of Africa. And just captures so much pain and suffering in that southern Saharan area. We're still being asked that question. In many ways. And the dawning will always be still. We want to finish today, just we go to that little note here, Terry.
Yeah, so we kind of come back to where we started. What's it all about? It's about these three things, and this one, of course, right at the centre of it. I guess what we've been saying all the time is that theology is the academic discipline, if you like, that takes this seriously. Doesn't, as the stereotype would suggest, mean that, you know, it's only for those who believe. It's not. It's not. But it takes that experience of humanity seriously. And it's relevant because that experience of humanity seems to be becoming more important again. As we started by saying, you know, it's fascinating that issues about spirituality and transcendent other, numinous, intelligent design, supreme force, actually coming at us from the same sciences that a couple of hundred years ago seem to push all of that off the plate. This is a bit of a map for you, whether you go on any further in theology or not. If you do, that's great, have a look. There are courses that will take up different aspects of that. That'll become like a little Gregory's for you. Hopefully you'll know kind of what you're dealing with, because it won't always be made as explicit as that. And if you don't go any further with it, well, that's fine. You know, maybe just remember that as a little guide to all sorts of things you'll come across as you're going through life. I wanted to just end, and then we'll have a bit of time for a chat. Really, where we began with the sciences, coming back to ask some of these big questions. With just a look at a beautiful little clip. I mean, it's an absolute gem. It's only about 30 seconds of Carl Jung giving one of his last interviews. And Jung, of course, was a classical, 19th into 20th century scientist, a psychotherapist, a contemporary of Sigmund Freud's, indeed a pupil and collaborator at one stage with Freud. Came unstuck quite badly with Freud in the latter bit of his life, partly at least over this issue about how seriously spirituality should be taken or not. It became so important for Jung that he really couldn't handle, I guess, much longer Freud's own deep cynicism about it. I mean, Freud just could not get away from the idea that religiousness meant neurosis, and that's all there was to it. And normally some kind of sexual neurosis. That was Freud's answer to virtually everything. But for Jung, he took a different path. I mean, he's a very interesting character because he should have been an atheist. Granted the times he was living and all of the influences around him, he should have been just become, like most of his contemporaries, a fairly rabid scientific atheist. But he ended up in a totally different place, which I think this kind of captures. Okay, I don't think that needs any more comment, except to say, the point of discourse or any theology is not that you end up knowing anything in particular. I mean, to me, that's disrespecting God. That one view would be imposed on others. It's so far from what theology should be about. It's so far, to me, from what believing people should be about. But it does capture something of the imponderable, I suppose, about that sense of other and where it can lead. An interesting thing about Jung is, of course, that in the end, he was so comfortable in his own skin as a believer, and indeed as one of the great scientists of his time. He's another Aquinas kind of character. We just need a few more of them. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time.